In many cases, group members nudge rather than push. They suggest rather than pressure. But in other cases, their influence can be extraordinarily strong. Rather than casually shaping opinions and choices, some will force others to do things they would rather not do. Good day, everyone. Today, here, we're going to consider the sources of that power and the consequences of power for those who wield it as well as those who are subjected to it.
Nobody joins a cult. Nobody joins something they think is going to hurt them. You join a religious organization, you join a political movement, and you join with people that you really like.
I think the early 60s had been a time of great optimism. The message of People's Temple was no, the dream is alive.
Oh no, who's going to decide who and when a person's going to die? We must never allow that, because this is the kind of thing that ushers in the terror of a Hitler's Germany.
What I saw recreation as being was building a city where we could move and raise our children outside of the oppression and the racism of the United States of America.
He said, this punch is going to be passed out to everybody here, and we will all die right here in the church together as one. It was just fucking slaughter. They're fucking slaughter.
We did not want this kind of ending. We wanted to live, to shine, to bring light to a world that is dying for a little bit of love.
That was the Jonestown Massacre occurred on November 18, 1978, when more than 900 members of an American cult called the People's Temple died in a mass suicide murder under the direction of their leader, Jim Jones. The U.S. Representative Leo Ryan, who had gone to Jonestown to investigate claims of abuse, was murdered along with 4 members of his delegation. That same day, Jones ordered his followers to ingest poison-laced punch while armed guards stood by. So, what is this power? Power is the assertion of a certain level of influence, control, or authority over other people. This social power is defined as the capacity to assert control by creating desirable, legitimate values without involving unconventional means, the capacity to produce intended effects in interpersonal contexts. Why did the Jonestown group obey Jones' orders? Can group members be so bent at the will of an authority that they will follow any order? Stanley Milgram was an American social psychologist best known for his controversial experiments on obedience conducted in the 1960s during his professorship at Yale University. His studies suggests that people can be bent at the will of an authority that they will follow any order. Milgram, in year 1974, tested people's obedience to an authority who ordered them to give painful and potentially harmful electric shocks to a Confederate. Note that there's no shocks were actually given. His experiments are called the obedience, situation, and the demands. Obedience is the compliance with authoritative directives pertaining to a given situation, including changes in behavior in response to instructions, orders, and demands issued by those with authority. This experiment aimed to know how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Milgram set the stage for the order-giving phase by having the learner make mistakes deliberately. Every wrong answer, the teacher would give a shock. And when the teacher or the participants hesitate to continue, the experimenter who was seated at a separate desk near the teachers would use a sequence of prods to goad them into action or to continue the said action. Prod 1 states that please continue or please go on. Prod 2, the experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And lastly, the Prod 4 states that you have no other choice, you must go on. The participants were torn between their duty and their desire to protect the learner from any harm.
The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person, and they drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher, and the learner was an actor hired, pretending to be a real participant. The learner, who was an actor called Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and researcher went into a room next door that contained an electric shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, which is a slight shock, to 375 volts, which had a danger reading of severe shock, and up to 450 volts, which is enough to kill a human being.
Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go in. Let me out.
Refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants were comprised of 40 males aged between 20 and 50, whose job ranged from unskilled to professional. They were paid $4.50 just for turning up to the study. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to the other participant, which was the actor, taking on the role as the learner. The experimenter, who was also an actor, was dressed in a grey lab coat, played by an actor, not Milgram himself. 2 rooms in the Yale laboratory were used, one for the learner with an electric chair, and another for the teacher and the experimenter with an electric shock generator. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was strapped to a chair by electrodes. After he had learned a list of paired words given to him to learn, the teacher tests him by naming a word and then asking the learner to recall its partner or pair from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose, and for each of these the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was to give a series of orders and prods to ensure that they continue. There were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter, who was called Mr. Williams, read out the next prod, and so on.
The Milgram experiment, obedience was measured by the level of shock that the participant was willing to deliver. While many of the subjects or the participants became angrily or hesitant to proceed to the activity, they nevertheless continued to follow orders all the way to the end. Milgram results suggested that 65% of the participants in Milgram's study delivered the maximum shocks. But actually, he was certain that people would stop after 5 to 6 shocks. But surprisingly, they go and proceed. The comments made by the participants during the shock procedure and their obvious psychological distress revealed that they were reluctant or hesitant to go on, but felt unable to resist the experimenter's demands for obedience, and that is the obedience to authority. Now, we are down to the topic social power in group with the question, what are the sources of power in groups? First, we have basis of power, French and Raven's 1959 theory of power basis emphasizes 6 sources of power. Note that power bases are the sources of social power in a group, including one's degree of control over rewards and punishment, authority in the group, attractiveness, expertise, and access to and control over information needed by group members. Now, let's take a look with that 6 sources of power. First, we have reward. It is the ability to reward. People in power are often able to give out rewards, such as raises, promotions, desirable assignments, training opportunities, and simple compliments. These are examples of rewards controlled by people in power. If others expect that you'll reward them for doing what you want, there's a high probability that they'll do it. Next is coercive. Coercive is the ability to punish. Coercive power is a source of power that is also problematic and can be abused. What's more, it can cause dissatisfaction or resentment among the people it's applied to. Threats and punishment are common coercive tools. You can use coercive power when you imply or threaten that someone will be fired, demoted, or denied privileges. Next, we have legitimate. Legitimate is simplified. It's power bestowed by obligation and a sense of responsibility, such as a president, a prime minister, or monarch has legitimate power. So does a CEO, a religious minister, or a fire chief. Electoral mandates, social hierarchies, cultural norms, and organizational structure all provide the basis for legitimate power. This type of power, however, can be unpredictable and unstable. If you lose the title or position, your legitimate power can instantly disappear because people were influenced by the position you held rather than by you. Next, we have referent. It is the desire to identify or not identify with the group. In teams, this power is built on respect, admiration, and trust. Referent power comes from one person liking and respecting other and identifying with them in some way. Celebrities have referent power, which is why they can influence everything from what people buy to which politician they elect. In a workplace, a person with a referent power often makes everyone feel good, so he tends to have a lot of influence. Next, we have expert, the perceived or actual extent or knowledge on the topic that is attributed to the person. Expert power is when you have knowledge and skills that enable you to understand a situation, suggest solutions, use solid judgment, and generally outperform others. People will listen to you, trust you, and respect what you say. As a subject matter expert, your ideas will have a value, and others will look to you for leadership in that area. And lastly, we have informational. It is having information others need or want. Having control over information that others need or want puts you in a powerful position. Having access to confidential financial reports, being aware of who's due to be laid off, and knowing where your team is going for its annual away day are all examples of informational power. We have another source of power in a group, and this is the power tactics. The 6 bases were not exhaustive. It doesn't examine, include, or consider all elements or aspects because when people need to poke, prod, or prompt others into action, their choice of power tactic or compliance tactic is limited only by their ingenuity, self-regulation, and willingness to ignore social norms. These power tactics are specific methods such as persuasion, bargaining, and evasion that people use to attain the goal of influencing others. These methods vary in a number of ways, with individuals selecting particular tactics depending on their personal characteristics and the nature of the group setting. We have three types of power tactics. We have hard and soft tactics. Hard tactics are more coercive. It leaves individuals less freedom than soft tactics. Hard tactics include exchange, legitimating, pressure, assertiveness, and upward appeal. These behavior are perceived as more forceful and push the person to comply. Soft tactics, on the other hand, are influence behavior which are considered thoughtful and constructive. Soft tactics include personal appeal, consultation, inspirational appeal, ingratiation, and rational persuasion. Next, we have direct, rational, and indirect, and non-rational tactics. Rational, it emphasizes reasoning, logics, and good judgment. Example of these are bargaining and persuasion, while indirect are subtle and difficult to direct because it must work by creating a favorable cognitive and emotional response. And lastly, we have unilateral and bilateral tactics. Bilateral includes interactive and involving give and take. Example, persuasion, discussion, and negotiation. While unilateral, it includes or without the cooperation of the target of influence. Example, demands, fates accomplish, evasion, and disengagement. One tactic which may explain the levels of obedience in the Milgram's experiment and Jonestown is the foot in the door technique. It is a persuasion tactic in which you get a person to comply with a large request by first asking them to comply with a smaller request. And we also have here the so-called brainwashing methods. It is used by Chinese military personnel during the Korean War and relied on various methods of influencing, including behavioral commitment. If we have social power in group, we also have here a social status in group. Question: what are the sources of status in group? First, we have claiming status. The status structure in a group defines differences in power and influence. Members strive for status in groups. The resulting pecking order defines who is dominant and who is submissive. Humans compete for status within the group. They don't really scream to mention their status, but there are a lot of nonverbal cues. People also seek status by speaking clearly, loudly, confidently, and directly. Personal characteristics, such as the need for power and political skill, predict those individuals who are more likely to strive for power over others. Example of this claiming status is bullying. It is the use of coercive influence against another, less powerful person. It can involve physical contact, verbal abuse, exclusion, or other negative action. Moreover, we also have here achieving status. Group members' perceptions of one another also determine status. Bourdieu's expectation states theory argues that group members allocate status by considering specific status characteristics and diffuse status characteristics. The primary goal of expectation state theory as applied to gender is to explain how observed differences between social groups become the basis for inequality in everyday social encounters. This theory believes that group members base their expectations on two types of status cues. We have specific and diffuse status characteristics. This specific status characteristic is a task-specific behavioral and personal characteristics that people consider when estimating their relative competency, ability, and social value of themselves and others. On the other hand, diffuse status characteristic is a general personal qualities such as age, race, and ethnicity that people consider when estimating their relative competency, ability, and social value of themselves and others. When status generalization occurs, Group members unfairly allow irrelevant characteristics such as race, age, or ethnicity to influence the allocation of a prestige. For the last source of status in a group, we have status hierarchies and stability. It is the status differences in groups may be an evolved adaptation. Hierarchies, meaning we humans live in groups with organized systems of power relation. Interpersonal complementarity is when no explicit instructions are provided. Within minutes, such groups form status hierarchies that all members can accurately describe without having ever explicitly discussed who will lead and who will follow. In short, this is a leaderless group. Status organizing processes rapidly create status differences, so this group will create a status differences. Finally, we are down to the last subtopic of our main topic, power, which is the metamorphic effects of power. Question: does gaining power have a transformative effect on people? First, we're going to deal with the changes in the power holder. People differ in the disposition level of personal power, but situational factors can also prime a sense of power. The idea that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is consistent with Keltner's in year 2016 with his approach inhibition theory, which suggests that power activates the approach response system whereas the loss of power inhibits actions. We have the positive and negative effects, but let's talk first about the positive effects, which include the increased activity levels, more positive emotions, consistent goal striving, enhanced executive functioning, increased authenticity, and lower levels of conformity. And here are the types of power's positive effects. In contrary, we have negative effects. These include the increased tendency to act in a risky or inappropriate way, a negative impact on others' emotional states, loss of perspective taking, the tendency to misjudge others, and increased self satisfaction. We have here types of power's negative effects. Now, let's know what are the reactions to the use of the power that we had mentioned earlier. First is that approach inhibition theory. It predicts that individuals who do not feel powerful will display more negative emotion and reduced motivation. So, their reaction, the individual who find themselves without power relative to others, will avoid rather than approach. Next is coercive methods have been linked to a number of dysfunctional group processes. It means conflict created by coercive influence can disrupt the entire group's functioning. Herbert Kalman identified three basic reactions that people display in response to that coercive influence. In some cases, the power holder only produces the first one, which is the compliance. It is the public conformity without internal private acceptance. This means you only disagree privately. Next phase is identification. It is the conformity motivated by desire to imitate and please the other. It occurs when the target of the influence admires and therefore imitates the power holder. If this phase identification prolonged and unrelenting, it can lead to the final stage, which is internalization. It is the private acceptance of the other's beliefs, values, and goals. The individual adopts the induced behavior because it is congruent with his value system, and their actions reflect their own personal beliefs, opinions, and goals. Next, Milgram's 1974 theory of the agentic state traces obedience back to the nature of the authority subordinate relationship. So, the reaction of people with this is that people allow others to direct with their actions and then pass off the responsibility for the consequences to the person giving the orders. Lastly, people who blame obedience on the individuals in the situation may be displaying the fundamental attribution error, or FAE, which underestimates the power of group level processes. FAE, this means they blame the personalities of the individuals rather than the powerful group processes at work that forced them to obey, even though a closer, more informed analysis of the situation would reveal the power pressures the members faced. Yet, obedience is not a reflection of the nature of the individuals in the group, but an indication of the power of the group itself.